I've been anxiously awaiting the Nikon Z 14-24mm f2.8s lens since I received my Z6 a little over a year and a half ago. In this video, I'm going to share with you some of my first impressions as I took this lens out for astrophotography and nightscapes over the last couple of nights. Hello everybody, I'm Will Cheney, and I recently rented the Nikon Z 14-24mm f2.8s lens from lensrentals.com. Over the last couple of nights, I put this lens to work at a couple of my favorite astrophotography and nightscape spots. If you're debating on getting this lens for astrophotography and nightscape, stick around to hear some of my pros and cons as well as see some of my test images. So to start off, I want to go over a couple of the key specs and features with this lens. First off, it's a 14mm to 24mm f2.8. That means you have a wide range of focal lengths to use for your astrophotography and nightscapes. The f2.8 aperture is going to allow you to bring in more light to the sensor, and paired with the 14mm focal length, it's going to allow you to have more light hitting your sensor. A couple of more specs to note on this lens is that it only weighs about 1.4 pounds. That's pretty light for a lens that's 14mm at f2.8. To know a little bit more about this lens, it has 16 elements and 11 groups. This lens is also very solidly built and does not look cheap at all. A few other features on this lens: you have a function button that you can auto-program to be whatever you want it to be. You also have 3 dials. Mine came programmed out of the box as the first dial being the focus, second dial to adjust the focal length, and the third dial, the one closest to the camera body, actually adjusts the aperture. Now you can set those up to do whatever you would like them to do. That's just completely based on your taste. Also, an interesting feature on this lens is the LCD display. So you can actually turn it on by hitting the display button, and then as you're going through your aperture, your focal length, or your focus ring, you can actually get displayed what's going on there. Is that really a big plus? I guess it's just personal taste. To me, I found I didn't even look at it when I was out in the field, but some people may like it. Another interesting spec on this lens: if you install the correct hood on it, you can actually put on a 112mm filter. How many people have a 112mm filter? Probably not that many. From what I've seen, they're very expensive, but it is an option now that the glass is actually flat in the front instead of bulbous. So a couple of pros with this lens for astrophotography: because you've got the 14mm, you can now extend your exposure time. When I was shooting the other night, I was typically shooting anywhere between 25 and 30 seconds. There is a little bit of star trailing going on at those exposure times, but since most of my prints typically just go on Instagram right now, I'm really not bothered by it, and I get to bring in more light. Another big plus for this lens is the f2.8 aperture. That's going to allow you to bring in more light for that same amount of exposure time that you might get on another 14mm lens. So now you're combining a 25-second exposure with an f2.8, and then I typically shoot at ISO 3200. That gives you a lot of light coming in, and I found at the 14mm focal length, I didn't need to bump it up to 6400 like I sometimes do shooting at 20mm. Okay, so a couple of cons on this lens. One of the hardest things I had an issue with was focusing out in the field. I'm used to just spinning the focus ring all the way to the infinity point and being able to just fine-tune those adjustments. What I found on this lens is that it's very hard to do just minimal adjustments. I've seen some tricks online where you turn the camera off, turn it back on, and that brings it up into the infinity mode. I actually didn't get a chance to try that out, but what I found worked for me was going all the way to infinity on the focus ring, backing it off just a little bit, and then coming back towards infinity, and all of my pictures came out sharp at that point. So really, that con for me just comes from the fact that I would rather have a focus ring that's not electronic, one that I'm actually mechanically moving the glass to focus. So that's just something to be aware of, especially if you buy this lens and you go out, and the first time you go out, you spin it to infinity and you're completely confused as to why you're out of focus. My next con, honestly, this one probably isn't something that Nikon can even do anything about, but I really wish this lens went down to f1.8. Now I understand that that would be probably a pretty big lens at this point to have adjustable 14-24 and f1.8. I just like having that f1.8 option just so I can bring in more light. The final con on this lens, honestly, is just the price. When you're looking at this lens online right now, it's retailing for about $2,396. That's a pretty hefty price tag, especially by the time you add taxes on, you're looking at closer to $2,600 just for one lens. I think that's going to bring a lot of hobbyists out of the market and leave it more towards a professional lens. I know for me, as a hobbyist, if I was just starting off, I'd have a really hard time buying this lens. So at this point, let's jump in and review a couple of the photos that I've taken over the last couple of days, and we'll run through looking at the f2.8, f3.2, and f3.5. So the first photo that I want to take a look at here, this was taken with about a half moon, so that's how I got the foreground and the church to illuminate. So it washed a little bit out of the Milky Way, but going through and looking at the photo, this was taken at ISO 3200 at 14 millimeters, f2.8 at 20 seconds. You'll notice it's a little dark in the corners, but really it's not that bad. And as far as coma goes, really don't see a whole lot. I guess there's maybe a little bit right there. A lot of this is more just the stars trailing a little bit more than anything. So the next photo here, it's the same as the last one, other than the aperture is now f3.2. So you can kind of tell the photo is just a little bit darker. You still have a little bit of darkness going on up here in the corners, but overall pretty great image. And then the next one here, this one is going to be f3.5. So again, just a little bit darker and still a little bit of vignetting going on here in the corners. I noticed it a little bit more in the sky than I do down here on the ground. So this may be more just that the light pollution is kind of tapering off as you're going further up into the sky. But overall, still really enjoy this photo. I think it turned out great. Looking in at 100%, doesn't look like much coma. I don't really actually see any. Maybe a little bit here, but that may just be that there's two stars that are really close together. Okay, so this was taken from another morning, a couple of days later. I went out to a different spot, a little bit darker out in this area other than this light pollution. There's a city that's over here a couple of miles away, but overall it's a pretty dark sky out at this location. So zooming in here, this one is ISO 3200, 14 millimeters, f2.8 at 25 seconds. A little bit of star trailing going on, but other than that, it's a pretty clean image for f2.8. Maybe some coma going on around that star, but I think that more than anything is just from it being bright. A little bit of vignetting. Again, you can kind of make it out going along there, and then again along here. Again, happy with the image. I think it turned out well. Of course, I'm shooting this. You can tell by the Milky Way, I'm not shooting this in the middle of the summer when you get those great photos of the core, but you can still make out the Milky Way in this photo. Again, kind of like the last set, this is 3.2. Still maybe a little bit of vignetting going on, not much coma, maybe a little bit again around this really bright star, but not too bad. I still think it's a pretty good image for being 3.2 instead of 2.8. And then moving on to the 3.5, again, slightly darker image as you'd expect, and maybe a little bit of coma around the star again. That super bright one seems to be more of an issue than these smaller ones, but good looking image again coming from that lens. So we'll take a quick look at these real quick with the compare tool. Okay, so looking at 3.2 and 2.8 side by side, this is the f2.8 over here on the left. We'll zoom in, we'll see if we can find one of those bright stars in the corner. See if we're getting very much coma or see any difference. Overall, doesn't look like it. Of course, the photo on the right's just a little bit darker. I mean, those two almost look identical around that star. Moving this on to look at the 3.2 and the 3.5 together. Again, I mean, like I keep saying, the 3.5 is darker than the 3.2. And we'll zoom in up here, see if we see any noticeable difference. I don't really see any difference in coma. Even I think if I went through and compared the 3.5 to the 2.8. So now this is just looking at f2.8 compared to 3.5, and really no difference in coma. Maybe a little bit in vignetting. It's kind of hard to tell with the light pollution tapering off towards the top of the photo, but I think the lens performed great for this set of photos. So another thing I was curious about on this lens was how it would perform at 20 millimeters. So I took a series of images at 20 millimeters, again doing f2.8, f3.2, and f3.5. So this is here at 20 millimeters. You can tell the church is a little closer in the foreground. We'll go ahead and zoom in. Kind of an interesting thing here, going to 20 millimeters though, you start to get this coma. Not really sure why you would get that at 20 millimeters versus 14, but I think it's pretty evident that it's there compared to the 14 millimeter shot. So we'll take a quick look at that zoomed in. So the 14 millimeter shot is over here on the right, and the 20 millimeter shot's over here on the left. I guess this isn't a true one-to-one look because these are situated slightly different in the composition, but I mean, still out here at the corners, 14 millimeter, there's no coma. You go to 20 millimeters, you start to get coma. So up next now, this is the f2.8 shot at 20 millimeters being compared to the f3.5. Something just to note on these two photos real quick. I didn't take photos for whatever reason at the same exposure on this one. For some reason, the f2.8 I shot at 20 seconds and the subsequent photos I shot at 15. So there's gonna be a little difference in that just from the lighting, but I mean, overall, still the same issue at 20 millimeters. That coma that's going on in the corners, but other than that, a pretty clean image. I'd be happy with this one. So just real quickly here, comparing these two images, 3.2 to f2.8, the f2.8 being over here on the left side. We'll go ahead and zoom in. Really the same coma problems going on with both of these images, both being at 20 millimeters, so there's got to be something going on with the glass at that particular focal length. Other than that though, I think they're pretty clean images. Again, still some coma going on here on the left. All right, so one last set of photos here for comparison. So one more set of shots here at 20 millimeters. So one thing that I find kind of interesting in this, this is at 20 millimeters again. A little bit of coma going on, but it's not nearly as much as what was going on in the last set of images. So comparing f2.8 to f3.2, really no difference other than slightly darker on the f3.2. And really not a whole lot of difference in the vignetting either. So once again, just really clean shot coming out of the 14 to 24 millimeter camera lens. And then just taking one last look here at the 14 millimeters, I was trying to go for a shot that had stars in all the corners. It's pretty evident in this photo that there is vignetting going on here at f2.8 and again at f3.2. You can just see it kind of sticking around in this haze in the corners, and then moving to compare the 3.2 to the 3.5. So again, a little bit darker photo here. To me, the vignetting is a little more noticeable in the 3.5. I think it's also because of the f3.5 not bringing in as much light, so it's a darker image in general. Again, I mean, I'm satisfied with these images. So all those images I just walked through were all unprocessed, just the raw images out of the camera. So this is one of the images that I've gone through and I've post-processed it to my taste. This particular shot was 20 millimeters at f2.8, 15 seconds, and an ISO of 3200. Like I said, there was a little bit of vignetting going on with the lens, but even with that and the coma that this image had up in the corners at 20 millimeters, to me, this is one of my favorite shots from that night. Moving on to the next one, this was a 14 millimeter photo at f2.8, 20 seconds, and ISO 3200. Love this shot as well. The way that the clouds kind of blow out from the center, from around the church, just really made it an awesome photo for me. Finally, I want to take a look at these two photos side by side, the 20 millimeter on the left and the 14 millimeter on the right. This will just give you some perspective as to how having a range of focal lengths can affect your nightscapes. Let me know in the comments below which one you like better and what focal length you prefer to shoot at for your nightscapes in astrophotography. So if you're looking at this lens just for specifically astrophotography, there's two deal breakers for me. First one being the price. I think there's better options out there, which I'll go over here in a minute. And then I also think if you're looking at it just for astrophotography, f2.8 is a little bit of a hindrance. I just find that f1.8 really helps you bring out even more light and more detail out of the Milky Way. The first alternative that I would consider would be the Nikon Z 20mm f1.8 S lens. This lens rings in at a price around $1,000. It just depends on whether or not you catch it on sale, that it comes in a little bit above or a little bit lower. The 20mm was a spectacular lens whenever I shot with it back in August at Big Bend. It's a crystal clear lens and made for some great astrophotography and nightscape shots. The next lens that I would consider as an alternative would be the Rokinon 14mm f2.8. This particular one that I have here is actually my old f-mount lens that I bought 2 years ago. Rokinon has since come out with a Z-mount lens, and I would highly recommend going that route, especially if you're a hobbyist and you've never shot the Milky Way before and you just want a way in to start learning how. I think it's a great introductory lens. It does have a little bit of vignetting and coma issues, but to be honest, some of the photos I've taken with it have been great, especially when you consider that the price tag is typically under $500. So in conclusion, I think the Nikon Z 14-24mm f2.8s is a fantastic lens. I'd highly recommend it for anybody that shoots astrophotography and nightscapes, and would also utilize the lens for landscape photography. Before I go, if you like this video, please be sure to click that like button down below, and also subscribe for more videos coming out in the future.